They told us stories about 1942 the way old sailors tell of storms, with a certain resignation in the throat, like it's a wound that will always ache. In every port there are maps with red pins and names, and there is always one pin someone will not touch. Ours was a ghost marked only in one way. A date, 1942, and a note scratched in pencil, lost, no survivors. The first line I remember telling the camera in my head was small and precise. We followed a ship that died before my father was born. That's the hook. It makes listeners ask, why chase an old death? The sub I shipped on was not modern by any stretch. It was tight and alive and full of habit. Diesel cold nights, sonar consoles that hummed with the kind of fidelity that chews up lies, and men who knew what the ocean kept and what it returned. We were sent for a simple job: follow a wreck trail that local fishermen and a few wartime charts insisted ended at a single point of suspicion. That point was the last known location of a merchantman lost in 1942. They wanted a survey, a verification, possibly some remains recovered, possibly nothing but rust and silence. For us, the mission smelled like history and bureaucracy and something in between. I can tell you how the sea looks at dawn. I can also tell you how the past looks when it floats up in sonar, like a dark bruise on the map. A short grounding before we go on. 1942 was one of the bloodiest years for merchant shipping and naval losses. The Battle of the Atlantic was at its height, and hundreds of Allied and Axis ships were sunk or lost that year. Convoys were attacked, merchantmen disappeared with their crews, the ocean kept their skeletons. That scale is important to understand why any hull marked Lost 1942 carries not just scrap metal, but entire lifetimes. There are thousands of wrecks from WW2. Each carries a name, a roster, a last mealtime. We had been asked to find one such roster. Operational truth. A contemporary submarine, even one on a special mission, follows a wreck with tools the WW2 sailors could not imagine. Side-scan sonar creates an image of the seafloor, like a photo taken with sound. Magnetometers map ferrous anomalies beneath sediment. Multi-beam bathymetry gives us the relief. Remotely operated vehicles, ROVs, and drop cameras put eyes on what the sonar finds. Those tools are how you turn a rumor on a chart into a picture you can show a next of kin, a museum, or a tribunal. For the first 2 minutes, I want you to imagine the sub like a blind man with a cane that sings, and every echo tells us whether we're near bone or just the sound of seaweed. We left port with a manifest thin as a rumor. The client was an institute that studies wartime wrecks, and the Navy signed off on a discreet mission, survey, and non-invasive inspection. The paperwork contains phrases like cultural heritage and no disturbance, but paperwork is shade and salt. Men still smell what the sea smells like. The captain briefed us the night before in a wardroom full of coffee and small jokes. He said flatly, "Whatever you find, remember the dead are not inventory." That line landed in my chest like an order and then like a prayer. The captain's prayer is a scaffolding for conscience. It's small and heavy. The approach to an old loss is a kind of reverse tracking. We start with archival sources and eyewitnesses. We had a few of both. An old fuel-stained chart annotated with a convoy number, a fisherman who swore he'd found timbers near a shoal in 1978, and a partial log entry from a coastal station. From there, the Nav's hydrographers build a search box, a rectangle of sea where the last signals and the drift models put the dead ship when the sea finished with it. That search box becomes our hunting ground. A search box is a map of probabilities. It is the difference between looking and finding. We ran survey lanes with the towfish. Side-scan sonar lights the seafloor in acoustic stripes. It paints shadows where a hull or debris field interrupts the flat. The first pass is always a little quiet. You want to look like you're seeing nothing to avoid wasting breath. The towfish hummed, and the console looked like a cathedral of green. The first lanes gave us nothing but texture, odd boulders, gullies, sand ripples, until the first real return appeared, a linear anomaly, long and angular, lying low. The towfish recorded it as a bright return with a shadow beneath, classic wreck signature. The image made us still, the way the smell of gunpowder makes a veteran still. The first signature on the screen is the closest thing you'll see on a sonar console. We checked the magnetometer sweep over the same path. A hull, even a small merchantman, carries ferrous mass enough to shift the magnetic field. The magnetometer sings differently above iron. Where the side scan showed an angular ridge, the magnetometer swung to life, a clear anomaly. Two independent sensors agreed we had something the sea had kept. That cross-check is why modern exploration rarely relies on a single tool. One proves, the other verifies. There are lies the sea tells, and lies the instruments tell. Two witnesses agreeing is like two instruments nodding.
We brought down an ROV on a tether that night, a little machine with lights like eyes and a manipulator arm. The ROV swims at the speed of caution, slow, deliberate, because one bump can erase a century by stirring silt. Its camera fed us grainy video, a bow collapsed inward, a propeller stilled in the mud, a bell plate with letters half-eaten by time. The ROV's light revealed paint flecks in a twisted lifeboat. Then, in the flicker, a name, half visible, a last two letters caught under corrosion. Land. I felt something cold and stupid like awe. There are moments when metal becomes memory again. In the first 2 minutes, I want the viewer to feel the untying of a knot. Sonar, magnet, camera. Each step pulls the rope a little further until the past comes loose. We logged images and we logged coordinates. We left nothing for gossip. But beneath the procedural calm was a human current you cannot map. The idea that some of those men died in manners that people still needed to answer. Where are they? Who were they? Where did their names go? That is not just academic. It is the reason a sub will follow a dead ship for days, weeks, or months. The wreck is not just metal. It is a ledger that somebody wrote on and forgot to close. The first 2 minutes of that ledger became the hook we handed to the story. A ship lost in 1942, a dark bruise on a chart, and a small sub that would not let it rest. The behavior that keeps a viewer, human stakes under technical detail. A ship's name, a roster, a face. That's why the rest of the hour will matter. The ROV's lights cut the dark like a surgeon's blade. You don't swim an ROV like you drive a car. You coax it, breathe with it. The camera shows the world in the slow rhythm of a machine. A bit here, a pan, wait, a push forward, a gust of silt, and everything blurs. In the console, you see the bow, then the keel, then the bones where hull plating has peeled like the skin of an apple. The first minute in the wreck is always a negotiation between patience and appetite. We had trained for months to be patient. The sea had its own appetite. The ROV fed back a close-up of the bell plate, and in half a second my fingers went numb. There were letters, not all of them, but enough. Mont, land, a name, a ghost with a scrap of title. We hovered the ROV and swept the lens. Sediment billowed like ancient ash and cleared to show a metal plate half covered by encrustation. The letters were pitted but legible, part of the ship name, a registry number half-eaten by time, and most oddly, a narrow bottle notched near a hatch hinge. Bottles in wrecks are not unusual. They trap air, paper, and sometimes time. You ease the manipulator, you cradle the glass, and you bring it up like an offering. ROV crew hands shake less on the sticks than the men who watch the feed. We all watched. We recovered the bottle, and inside, folded, water-stained, was paper. Paper is anachronistic at sea. It is a human thing in a machine world. Back on the deck, under the glow of lamp huts, we unrolled the manifest with gloved hands. The paper tasted of brine and mildew. The ink had bled like old maps. but the names were there in cramped block print, and beside them, in a different hand, a short note: ship transferred to convoy, due east of shoal, 1942, log entry corrected. There were crew names, ranks, and small annotations like sick below and shift change at 0200. One entry, a line item in pencil that bent the list, read extra cargo, classified, manifest, sealed. A sealed manifest mentioning classified cargo in a merchant hull from 1942 is a needle in a haystack, and needles bleed whatever they pierce. We cross-checked the names against the naval rosters the archive had provided. Most matched casualty lists. One name did not. One name, a petty officer listed as St. John, did not appear in any of the coastal records, yet in the manifest he had a rank and a list of dependents scribbled in the margin. The margin note read like a man who expected someone to read it later. For master, when found, return to sister in Blackwater. That small domestic plea made a boardroom problem into a human ledger. We printed and copied and wrote the UTC coordinates beside the manifest entry in ink. Technical aside, recovering paper from undersea sediment requires conservatorship steps immediately. Expose an inked page full of salts and it will degrade in hours. We had a small heated tray on deck and a conservations kit to flush the paper in distilled water and then in grated alcohol. The conservation made the paper legible enough to transcribe accurately. That's protocol, and that care makes archaeology ethical, not just investigative. Conserving paper is a race against chemistry. Saving a name is sometimes literally saving a piece of a life. We transmitted the transcribed list up the chain for verification. The hydrographic office replied in bureaucratic prose. The wreck lay within the boundaries of a World War II loss, but did not match the single ship they expected. Their archives indicated the vessel we'd been sent to examine had indeed been sunk in 1942, but in a different grid entirely. Our coordinates were for a different vessel from the same year, a freighter that, on paper, had transported munitions for an ad hoc military contract. The manifest in our bottle referenced classified cargo. That phrase is a trigger the military machine treats like a hot iron. It means someone may have a reason to quiet the story. The manifest matched a name, but not the coordinates expected. It was as if someone had taken the ledger and moved the entry to a new grave.
The captain and the naval attaché we carried met in the wardroom that midnight, while the rest of us watched dry footage and coffee dregs. The attaché was diplomatic and nervous. His smile never relaxed. He asked for the manifest, and then, in a voice that was careful as a scalpel, he said, "If this cargo was classified, we must be mindful of international protocols. Cultural heritage does not extend to munitions." That sentence is a bureaucrat's way of saying the dead are overlapped by security. Protocols exist to protect both memory and national security, and sometimes the two tug against each other like enemies at a rope. Official language can be a blade that cuts the human from the mechanical. We pressed anyway. We fed the archive with our notes, and an analyst sat up with a lamp and started looking through cable filings, convoy reports, and old decrypted radio logs. The story that unfurled was one of misdirection. The missing vessel had been listed as sunk by enemy action in the official reports, but a later cable, marked confidential, indicated a rerouting and a transfer of specified cargo to a different escort. That cable had a stamp, top secret, interagency. Whoever decided to move the cargo did so in a night of fog and code. The cargo line in our manifest corresponds to that transfer. Top secret transfers in the middle of a war can become permanent and misplaced in ordinary time. We dug deeper, and here is where the contradiction sharpened into a blade. The transfer logs recorded that cargo moved from Merchant Hull A to an auxiliary support vessel that operated under a cover identity. The support vessel had no formal registry in some public logs. In plain terms, the government had moved goods secretly in wartime and left a paper trail that later had been partially redacted or misfiled. That is not unusual for wartime operations. What made it dangerous was what the manifest's pencil note implied. The cargo was not just munitions, but a sealed container marked medical/logistics on the surface and classified beneath the scrawl. The more paper you peel, the more your fingers find the state's thumbprints. One of the names on the manifest, the mysteriously absent St. John, reappeared in a private ledger the analyst found tucked inside a different file, an interdepartmental memo that read like an apology. The memo, dated 1943, mentioned a surgical transfer of prisoners and hinted that sensitive nationals had been on board. The memo used a euphemism and a code phrase, civilian internment contingent. The implication jumped off the page like a live coal. If true, then the question changed from which ship sank to what was being moved and were humans carried as part of a secret convoy. A hidden phrase like civilian internment contingent is a key that opens a darker door than a mere list of goods. We re-examined the wreck imagery. The ROV moved with instruments and a manipulator into a dark hold. The cameras found objects we did not expect, not merely rusted crates, but personal effects, a locket, a child's toy, fragments of uniforms. The presence of personal items inside cargo crates suggested someone had packed people's belongings in haste and zeal. The ROV arm brushed a stack of insulation and revealed bones in a narrow cavity, human bone. We shut the camera down for 15 minutes because a sub does not become a morgue before it is authorized. Men do not forget what they have seen beneath a lamp. The site changed our mission from survey to recovery and accountability. The discovery of bone makes a ledger into a courtroom. The balance tilts from curiosity to responsibility. At this point, the mission's legal and moral lines smacked into each other. International law and UNESCO-like heritage rules encourage non-invasive approaches to wrecks, but human remains complicate the rules. Dead bodies carry rights of their own. Protocol demanded notification to higher command and the possible involvement of forensic teams ashore. The attaché's phone began to ring with the kind of calls that make men's hands go cold. The Navy's initial message, document and secure, hardened into a classified hold. To no disturbance without express authorization. That phrasing is a command and a fork. Do you obey the hold and close a mouth? Or do you open the case and risk the hand that calls you to account? When a mission turns from research to evidence, the first casualty is often clarity. We canvassed the crew for a vote. The captain convened a meeting in the wardroom under a tentative authority. We will follow chain of command first, but we will also file evidence with a neutral body. The room was split. A few men, myself among them, believed the moral imperative overrode the desire for bureaucratic safety. Others whispered about desertion to avoid the political fallout. The hydrographer argued we could create a detailed package for the archive. The ROV pilot wanted to go back and take direct samples. The PTSD of dealing with old deaths met the modern fear of political fallout. Ethical choices are slow and human, and they break men in ways machinery does not. We chose to file evidence up 2 channels, a full technical package to the ministry and a sealed copy to an independent maritime heritage trust we trusted. The sealed copy was a small rebellion dressed in civility. Data, coordinates, imagery, and transcribed names. We made duplicates and hid them in innocuous logs. That evening, the sea was a slow glass. The moon made a round coin on the water. The ROV dove again, this time to retrieve a sample from a tin crate labeled indecipherably. The manipulator brushed the lid, and a laminated card slid free into the camera light. A printed name list, a scrawled note, and an insignia that matched a wartime auxiliary. The handwriting had a smudge that matched the manifest's pencil stroke.
Evidence that lines up like sonar and handwriting that matches. Coincidence is a thin soup in which you drown slow.
Then the phone calls started coming in different voices. An overt call from the ministry asked for an immediate stop to any lifting operations. A covert call, via the attaché and in a man's quiet voice, suggested that some things are best handled at the bureau. The captain sat with both calls in his hands and made a decision that is the hinge of the story. He ordered the ROV back for one last pass, not to remove evidence, but to photograph and leave. He wrote a memo to the minister requesting formal authorization to retrieve human remains for repatriation. Then, before sending it, he walked to the mic and addressed the crew in a voice that did not want to be afraid. A captain's choice at this fork shapes the rest of the men's lives. But while we waited for paper to arrive, the sea decided on its own action. That night, a small support vessel, one we had not invited and had not seen in the scheduled manifest, dropped 2 bright LEDs over our position and circled like a hunting light. We logged the contact and raised the RIB. The small vessel made an approach and flashed a code that on the surface appeared maritime, but the hull markings watched and found none that matched any public register. Its emblem was a ring with a blank center, an emblem we had seen in other contexts and that raised old, cold hairs on the backs of elbows. The craft stayed in the lee and did not admit to a registry on radio. Unannounced vessels operating after dark at a sensitive site are not benign. They are a second hand on the same clock. We called the squadron. There was a delay. The support craft, call it the blank ring craft for the shape of the emblem, transmitted a short-range UDP-like packet to our net requesting secure communications. The packet's header matched a subcontractor's seal, but the payload was empty. That empty payload is an operating theater technique. Present authority by header, but provide minimal content to keep bureaucracy off balance. The blank ring craft hailed, "This is Auxiliary Support Vessel 3. We stand by to assist." We played polite and asked for manifest. They declined to reveal more, citing operational restrictions. Help with no paperwork is often a request to trade your agency for their convenience. The captain, not a fool, asked them to identify in plain terms. The reply came not from a human voice, but from a simple encrypted tone, and then silence. We recorded it and passed the data to the hydrographic office. The office returned a terse message: "Do not engage, wait." That same message came with a courier notice. An inspector would arrive at dawn via surface tender. The inspector's name matched a man who had previously been assigned to the ministry's wartime archives. That man's arrival was either providence or a slow insect crawling toward the apple. An inspector from archives arrives like a scorpion at the picnic. He can sting and hide in protocol. Dawn came, and with it the inspection team. The inspector was precise and cool. He walked the deck, smiled thinly, and asked questions we had not thought to answer. "Did you disturb anything?" he asked. We read our policy answers. He nodded and suggested in the coziest possible voice that any recovery risked diplomatic difficulty. "Some families prefer privacy," he said, and his eyes narrowed like the lid of a safe. He took our sealed packet and asked permission to carry it to his van. The captain, trusting the chain, signed the paper that let the man take the packet ashore. Handing evidence to an official man is the moment you either get justice or start a walk into bureaucracy. The inspector left. We watched the tender's wake until it blurred into a line on the horizon and then vanished. A quiet settled. We dove again for more imaging, and in the bowels of the wreck, the ROV's light found a metal crate corroded through at one seam. Inside, long blackened cylinders lay nestling like sleeping things. The manipulator's chemical sensors read trace residues similar to propellant, munitions. The smell of powder in the feed made men close their eyes. The implications of classified cargo hardened into something more dangerous. Munitions in a merchant's hold changes the nature of the loss from accident to weaponized secret. We recorded everything and filled more packets. Then the tidy machinery of the world performed its tidy erasure. The inspector's van left with the seal, the ministry acknowledged receipt, and then, days later, a note arrived through secure channels saying the site was under temporary control for national security reasons. That notice also said briefly that sensitive material recovered may be disposed of under authority. That is the sort of phrasing that cohabits with silence. Disposed of under authority is the language of finality without truth. What we learned over the next few weeks was ugly and slight. The ministry's archived cable showed that in 1942 there had been an operation to move sensitive nationals aboard merchant runs when ports were too dangerous. That term had been used to disguise the relocation of persons considered politically sensitive, and some of those transfers had been so secretive that later bureaucrats wanted the paper buried rather than the facts aired. The manifest and the bottle matched that story. The munitions, suggesting the merchantmen also carried war material, raised the stakes. It meant lives were moved in the same hold as instruments of violence. For some in command, the calculus was hide the cargo, move the people, and avoid public alarm. The moral arithmetic of secrecy is always, does the end justify the erasure?
A month later, the inspector returned the sealed packets, but with black marks across blocks of text. Names, dates, and coordinates were redacted. When we asked for justification, we were given doctrine and national security briefs. When we pushed, we were told the material went to special custody. The seas are wide and households are small. Names that get redacted vanish in ways that paper cannot correct. A grieving sister whose name we'd circled in our ledger got a reply from the ministry, polite, stiff, and anonymous. There is no record of your brother in our transport logs. That letter was a physical blow. Men I had known for years wept quietly in bunk rooms. The human ledger had been shaved. Bureaucratic denials replaced graves with silence. And then, the final twist that kept the captain's eyes on the safe. A small follow-up ROV pass months later showed the wreck disturbed. The prop, once stilled and corroded, had fresh tool marks. The bell plate that had once shown Montland had been hammered and then re-stamped in a different set of characters. Someone had been back and altered the wreck to obscure identity. That is an act of tampering with the dead and an admission that the living worry about questioners. We had evidence and images, but the images arrived in our inbox as compressed files with redaction overlays from the ministry. The world had taken our truth, processed it, and then returned a stylized version. True in the sense of pixels, false in the sense of story. Altering the wreck is the sea's final indignity. It changes what the future can know. Years after I left the boat, a historian published a paper that stitched together declassified cables and survivor testimony to suggest that wartime agencies had rerouted certain convoys and used merchant hulls for ad hoc tasks. The paper referenced our ROV images in a footnote, but had to phrase them carefully. The author ended with a sentence that looks like a threat wrapped in an apology. War requires transgression. Memory requires account. That is not the end of the story. The end of the story is the letter from a woman named in our manifest who never got an unredacted reply. She wrote to me years later and said simply, "You found our list. Thank you, but we now must live with the silence." Sometimes discovery is consolation. Sometimes it's a wound you reopen for the living. I keep the manifest copy carefully folded in a drawer. The captain's final order before he retired was a small private thing. If anything of this world ever asks you to bury a truth, remember that your hands will carry the weight. Don't be light-handed. That advice sounds simple until you realize the hands that hold truth sometimes tremble. The last line I will leave you with is small and hard. Maps get redrawn, wrecks get tamped down, but names are stubborn. They return like gulls.